my co mom, and so he's like growing his hair out, but he hates all the things that are associated with long hair. He's like, he hates it when we comb it. He doesn't like the knots. I'm like, look, man, you could be like Dad's hair. It's very aerodynamic, never gets messed up. It's like really, it's funny to watch this like 3.5-year-old. Like, he's really torn through this decision making. He's like, I like the long hair, but it's a pain in the ass, and like maybe I could shave my head like Dad's, and it'd be really easy, but I really like my hair. And like, it's so funny to watch him like live out this experience.
Good on him. Well, I was just taking off a shirt which is like this, super fluffy, and my hair was everywhere. I was like, ooh, this is not good timing.
Hi, you look gorgeous as always. How are you doing? How are things?
Yeah, really good, really good. What about you?
Good, busy. You know, launch of the book and just life, and you know, it's. I now understand why people don't launch books when they have full-time jobs. It turns out like doing both at the same time is just really, really hard.
Yeah, I've got a book actually in the planning, and I'm scared to death. But,
oh, no. Don't be scared of it. I don't want to make it sound bad. It's a lovely experience. It brings you into contact. You know, the lovely thing about it actually is it's caused me to talk to people that I haven't talked to in a while, which is really lovely, right? Because they see your name, you know, associated with the book, and they're like, oh, this came across my social media. We should get coffee. Like, and it's lovely because, you know, you just reconnect with some people that you like but don't always get to see. And I think it's a good reminder of all those people that I really, really like but don't always get to see.
Yeah, true. When are you going to launch the book?
It's out. I mean, it came out June something, 11th, 12th, something like that.
Oh, so very fresh, like a week.
Yeah, about 2 weeks. About 2 weeks old, amazingly, and you know, is selling well, and people seem to be happy about it. But you know, books are also just a weird. There's very little data around it, right? And so it's very hard to know what and when. And it's funny because, you know, books are also really interesting because this is actually a totally interesting thing that someone pointed out to me the other day that I don't think about. We're so used to digital where you buy it and use it in the same moment, right? Our like knowledge of you buying it is the moment of action. Books are so interesting because you like buy a book and then you read it like 3 weeks later or whenever like you get, you know what I mean? Like you buying it is not indicative of you reading it. Mm-hmm. And so it's been funny, like this past weekend, it was really nice here in New York and a really nice weather. And a bunch of people were like tweeting photos of them outdoors reading my book with various kinds of booze, right? People were like, you know, having a dry white and feel joking around about it. But it's funny because like, I know they got their book weeks ago, right? I know they bought it on launch day. They bought it 2 weeks ago, but like, you know, it just takes 2 weeks in modern life to get to a place where you have time to actually read that book. And so it's so funny because it was always that way, right? When we were kids, that was how all data worked, right? Like purchase and use were different. Now, with the advent of digital, like the assumption is the moment you purchase, you start using it. If you upgrade if we look at freemium models, right? If you upgrade to the paid version of an app, the assumption is, and you immediately start using the paid version of that app, right? You bought it in the moment of need. There was no notion of anticipated need. Now it's all about, you know, like physical products are about anticipated need. I'm not going to buy this book when I intend to read it. I'm going to buy it knowing that I eventually intend to read it.
Yes, I can hear you. I've got 5 books next to my bed and I'm trying to get through all of them one by a time.
Exactly. I think that's how it works, right? Like the buying of something is incredibly decoupled from the actually consumption of it, which is so weird.
Yeah, but you know, it's also the excitement to get there, and the next book is already waiting. If I have it, I've got just behind me. This stack is my year-to-date consumption. So there are a few books on there already, which is good.
That's the done stack.
Yes, that's the done stack.
Now the good question is, how does that compare to the to-read stack?
Oh yeah, this is another story. We don't want to get into this.
Like, I'm actually sitting on a pile of books that are on the to-read stand. It's a very different height. Yeah, it's funny, and I don't, you know, everything I read is on my phone these days, right? I don't read that way anymore, and so it is very, very interesting to me to watch that sort of play out. It's so interesting. I watch people on the subway, and I'm like, are you playing a game on your phone, watching media, or reading something, right? And it's like a fun, like, because everyone has the same looking behavior, right? You're like looking at your phone. I often think about the judgments that people have. Like, I read on my phone on the subway every day for about an hour, and I see people looking at me, sort of in the like, oh, you're just on your phone. I'm like, no, I'm reading a fucking book, right? It just happens to be on my phone. But I think we would judge somebody differently. Like, I think if we saw somebody carrying a physical book, our identity judgment about them would be very different. One of the things that is really interesting about phones is they obscure identity, right? You can't tell what someone is doing on the phone. They could be fucking watching porn. They could be reading a book, right? Like, they could be writing a book. Like, I wrote a lot of my book on the phone while I was on the subway, right? I'd sit and write on the subway. It just is amazing to me that, like, phones obscure identity in such an interesting way. Like, I want to wear a sign that's like, no, I swear I'm reading.
Red face, red everywhere. I'm reading. I'm definitely reading.
I promise I'm reading. I promise I'm reading.
Oh my God. So you've got back-to-backs today.
Yeah, it's been a crazy, this whole week is crazy. I fly out tomorrow morning for San Francisco. I just got a lot going on. But I'm glad we got to hook up. And so tell me what's up with you. Tell me about the podcast. Tell me about you and tell me what's going on. I know we're recording already. I've already done half the podcast. I just talked my way through a bunch of marketing shit.
Chop and change and all of it. So thanks God for technology. Well, where to start? I've got two companies, and basically both companies are preparing for the future of work, whatever that might be. One company is for individuals, and it's a lot of career coaching and personal branding, and basically how can you monetize yourself. And the other business is for businesses. So I'm working with companies to map out the talents that they need in order to achieve their goals for the future, to attract them. I run hackathons for recruitment, so I do it a bit differently. I run leadership retreats and an entrepreneurship academy to develop careers within the organization, and everything in between. So this is where we are at today. But Australia, you've been here. It's a lovely country, and I wouldn't move anywhere else. But it's also a long way away from everything and a little bit behind.
It's so interesting. And the economics of the future of work are so interesting there, right? Because Australia has sort of a progressive economic system, and the right to work, anybody can come for a year, on a visa, and there's healthy government subsidies for employing Australian engineers. And I know several people who have moved to Australia and started companies just because it's become very attractive to do that there.
But that's also the issue, I think. It's, as you said, it's a very attractive country to start a business. And this is what Australia is known for, but it's not known for scaling and growing in business. So we've got a tiny little percentage of businesses that are above the 10 million, and that's even a small business.
Yeah, it's really, and that is hard. And that is, big hits are what make an ecosystem, right? If you look at Silicon Valley, right, the big companies, you look at Seattle, right? Nobody talks about Seattle startups, but there's a million really great Seattle startups because Microsoft basically just sort of threw off so many millionaires that they could, sort of self-float for a while, and the market dynamics sort of established the thing. And the hard part of Australia is, if you don't birth some really big companies, Atlassian, you have a couple of sort of like places that are great, but even Atlassian is not huge, right? A lot of that is international talent, right? Like, it's just like it's a hard nut to crack. And, it's giant geographically, but, there's only a few sort of major cities, right? And even the ones that are big aren't like that big. I don't know. I think the future of Australia and the future of work in Australia is particularly, it's an interesting place. It's also a very hard place, right? Because, when you look at like Norway or something, some Norwegian is going to listen to this podcast and send me an angry note. Like, I'm from Oregon. Oregon is, I'll pick on my own, sort of state. I'm from Oregon. It's beautiful, but it rains 300 days a year, right? And so when it rains 300 days a year, it's easy to get work done because it rains 300 days a year, right? But Australia, like, it's so gorgeous, and the temptation, I think, is always to be out and doing other things, and it does have such a good social support system that I don't think it necessarily drives the hunger mentality that fueled sort of the San Franciscos of the world, where the weather's not great and that kind of thing. I don't know. It's a totally interesting. I love Australia. I love every time I've gone there. The people are great. I love the culture and attitude and approach to things. So I'm bullish on Australia in general, but it certainly has an uphill battle in some ways.
Yeah, but that also means a lot more opportunities to come, which is a good thing.
100%, right? Lots of opportunity for growth. And the last time I was there, I actually had a chance to give a talk at one of the universities in Brizzy, and it was just amazing to me. There's a ton of great engineering talent, right? Like tons and tons and tons of great technical talent. I do think
not enough.
Well, there's never enough. I mean, there's never, like, everywhere we'll go, there's not enough engineers.
No, but statistically, we've got 5,000 IT graduates a year, and we need 200,000. So that's how big the gap we've got.
I know, and I think it's but the programs are there. It's just the population has to sort of rise to meet it, and that's not easy to do. It's an interesting country for remote work, right? There are some parts that have that can be very, very remote. In terms of connectivity and things, right? There's a massive geographic spread. I don't know. It's a fascinating market, but I've really enjoyed my time there. And I do think that one of the things I really like about my visit to Australia, as I think about work and the culture of work, is, there was a saying at Microsoft that people used to say, pissing in your Wheaties, which was the tendency for people to, like, when you presented an idea, to immediately say no. And one of the things I really love about Australia is I feel like the immediate answer isn't no. There's room to, culturally, there's room to consider sort of newness. And I think that's like a strong sign for a future of entrepreneurship and in small companies. But to your point, look, you got to have some winners. You got to have some winners. Right? And so, you'll get there, give it time. It's a relatively new startup ecosystem. So, even New York has struggled with this, right? Like many of New York's like potential megaliths, Meetup coined, Meetup became an adjective in the world to meet up, right? Like a meetup became its own noun, but like had sort of a mediocre exit to WeWork because they kind of rested on their laurels and they didn't grow and they didn't build anything new. ZocDoc, this is like an endless Foursquare. There's just like an endless number of New York startups. Etsy, Kickstarter, right? There's an endless number of New York startups that did okay, but they're not, they tend to have this problem where they sort of plateau. And it's how do you really go and keep growing that New York has been really tough at, I think.
So from that aspect, Australia's next.
Yeah, well, I mean, look, maybe we'll all the New Yorkers will move there and start their next company. I like that idea. What are you even thinking about from a future of work perspective?
Well, different aspects. So, everyone is talking about diversity. I think it's kind of a 2016 topic from that aspect, because it's not about females and males. It's about how can we integrate a truly global workforce that we can tap into, global skill sets no matter where they are. Also offer really flexible work environments where, moms, if they wanted to work from 10 p.m. to 4 a.m., they could. But currently it's still not a regular thing. The same with how can we integrate artificial intelligence and technology as part of the human team and make that all fully functioning. So there's so much more that we haven't even scratched the surface yet. The same with when a business grows, it's still very much the common sense that, well, you need to get more people on board. Well, it's actually not the case, because sometimes staff who've been there for a while, they want to jump to the next learning curve and want to grow and develop and take on more responsibilities. But nobody has got this conversation in the first place. So it's just adding more bodies for the sake of it. And then staff are leaving because they don't see that there's any more opportunities to grow. So there's just, lack of communication, but also lack of awareness. And, nobody's really prepared for leadership of tomorrow, what that actually means.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I was having a conversation with Gus Warren this morning from Samsung Next, which is their ventures arm here in New York. And he and I were talking about, he's got 3 kids. I'm going to butcher their ages. I think they're like 2, 5, and 9 maybe. And we were just talking about, there's this unspoken thing where if you're an executive, you just don't see your family that much, right? Like many executives, I was talking to a guy the other day who spent 200 days in hotels last year, right? Like, that's a huge taxonomy. You like tax on people. You burn people out. The flexible work schedule is really interesting to me in terms of like, it is surprising to me that we've arrived at this point still where we know there's so much good science about, how much flexibility helps. And yet people just still, so many companies, cling to really traditional notions of, well, unless I keep my eye on people, unless they're 9 to 5, unless I watch their breaks, unless I blah, 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 right? They won't do it. It's really interesting to me. I often think about sort of like what technologies do we need and software products do we need to develop to remove the inhibiting pressures to changing people's work environment, right? What is it about flexibility that makes people so nervous, right? That people just won't sort of grow and do. It's interesting, a lot of it I think comes back to a lot of employers still have sort of an interestingly combative relationship with their employees. They still view their employees a little bit paternalistically, right? Like if I don't pay attention to you, you'll wander off and you won't do work and you won't be motivated and you won't whatever, right? But I think about, I have a 3.5-year-old and, Steph and I sort of split time and do everything we can. And I do everything I can to be sort of as present a father as I can. And, so much of that is about flexibility. It's the ability to work from home on days when I want to work from home. And, it's so interesting, even meeting Gus this morning, right? Like we met during, I don't know, I think we met at like 10 o'clock or something, right? Like if you expected me to be in my office at my desk 9 to 5 every day, like I'm not taking those meetings, right? Because they're not going to happen anymore. But yet that's where all that creative collision comes from. Gus and I had real things to talk about. People have real things to talk about. Like, I just think that there's I would love to see more of the privilege that is associated with being at the top of the pyramid in work trickle down. The gap in salary, the multiple in salaries between CEO salaries and their lowest employee salaries has just become massive, right? Just become massive. But, and there's some press about that and people sort of like get up in arms about it and talk about it. But what they don't talk about is like the privilege gap of everything else, right? The CEO can, work when they want to work and how they want to work and on the devices they want to work. And if the CEO decides he wants to use a BlackBerry, well, guess what? IT is going to figure out a way to let him use a BlackBerry, right? And so little of that trickles down to the average employee, right? The average employee still is expected to be in a particular time, at a particular place, doing a particular thing, right? In a really fairly micromanaged way. And it's just sad to me as like executives have had greater and greater privilege that more of that privilege does not trickle down to other people. Because clearly it works. Your executives are doing it, right? And so if your executives can do it, why would you assume that your line level workers can't do it, right? Are they like so fundamentally different?
In being out of control and being able to influence your own life, even though it might be just a couple of hours difference, but it can make all the difference. And if that's all it takes for people getting more out of their work and putting more in with that, it's just so such an irrelevant question it seems, but it's still so topical and we haven't even scratched the surface in that aspect.
It's so funny too, because it really goes both ways. I have the behavioral science team works for me here at Clover, and I have a sort of a policy of we all work from home on Tuesdays. Like as a policy, no one comes in on Tuesdays. No one is allowed to come in because I want everybody to.
Why is it Tuesday?
Well, we just picked a random day because otherwise, what happens is like Matt's out at the doctor on Monday and you're out at the doctor on Tuesday. The whole team never gets together. But if we pick a day where like everybody's out of the office, hey, if you have to have a doctor's appointment, schedule it on a Tuesday. Everybody else isn't good. Like there's no. It removes the inhibiting, it removes that pressure to be in the office if there's a day where everybody's not going to be there, right? We're all still working. We meet in the morning. We do our, we're still working remotely. We have a group Zoom that we all love to like hang out in, but there's not that same sense of pressure. You got to build it in structurally. But it's funny to me. I've told my employees a million times, like my team, a million times, like, I don't care if you work a minute, an hour, a day, a week, a month, right? As long as you reach the outcome that I've set out for you, if you do it all in a minute, well done you. Congratulations, you brilliant person for doing it in a minute. And yet they still it's still hard for them to not constantly try and sort of tell me what days they're going to be off or working from home or doing these things. I'm like, I don't care. Like, that's fine. Just do as long as we will talk about your outcomes. We have regular, weekly one-on-ones. We'll talk about your outcomes. If there's a problem with your outcomes, we can talk about your outcomes, but your process should be yours. You should own the way that you do the work, right? I think about pro athletes all the time. Like, how do I treat my employees like pro athletes? How do I treat my teammates like pro athletes, right? Nobody goes to Jordan and is like, hey man, you really got to shoot the ball this way, right? Like we're mandated. You got to shoot the ball this way. No, Jordan shoots the ball however he wants to reach the outcome that is points. Now, look, as a coach, you could say, here's a process that might work for you, and you can set the outcomes. Hey, I really need you to like hit a bunch of 3-pointers, but how they do it, you really, we just need to, but again, to your point, it makes people feel in control, right? Yeah. So much I think of what we talk about work habits that are destructive is about feeling in control. And so, I think one of the things that we could do as future of work folks, people who are trying to influence the work environment, is how do we create systems that allow people to feel in control, right? Whether that's Monday or Microsoft Teams or, Asana or something that allows you to have visibility into, hey, what's going on with people? Where are they on these things? How's it going, right? Stuff's getting closed, stuff's getting open.
But it also requires this shift of mindset that it's not given to us, but we need to take responsibility of our own career and of our own lives. And we cannot just blame somebody else saying, well, he didn't tell me that I could, progress in this corporation, or I didn't know that I could learn more and then could actually be a leader, or whatever it might be. And not many people, I think, feel that way straight away, or they have just been in the traditional environment for so long that it requires too much of a change that they are scared of, but what if I'm doing the wrong things? So I'd rather stay here, stay in my safe little box, and it's not too bad, and come up with all those excuses.
Yeah, I mean, I think education has a big part of that, right? Educational systems around the world I don't think we introduce choice early enough, right? Letting people sort of guide their path. I always, so I was an Eagle Scout, and in the Boy Scouts, when you advance between ranks, they're basically capabilities inventories. So if you're going from like a tenderfoot or like, a second class to a first class, let's say, here's a list of skills you have to have. You have to be able to tie these knots. You have to demonstrate that you can start a fire, like whatever. But you can do them in whatever order you want, right? Like, here's a list. You can't advance until they're all done, but you can do them in whatever order you want. So if you want to start with the hard ones, start with the hard ones. If you want to start with the easy ones, start with the easy ones, right? Like, and then at the end of it, you go before a council that can quiz you on any of them. So like, on this inventory was tying a square knot. Here's a piece of rope. Can you tie a square knot? And let's demonstrate to us that you can do this thing, right? And we'll prompt you if it's hard. We'll prompt you to sort of think about it. But choice within boundaries. Obviously, I don't love unrestricted choice. I think that's chaos, and I think the paradox of choice is very real. Like, I don't want to diminish motivation by too much choice, but it does feel like here's a list of things you have to know. Let's tackle them in the order you want to tackle, like whatever order you want to tackle them in. Let's let that be the order you tackle them in.
Exactly.
People talk about like lowering the bar or those, it's the exact same set of inventory. It's the exact same skills we've always taught, right? It's the same list of things that we want. And so, you can't argue to me that we're lowering the bar for certain people or making a comment. Like, letting people do them in the order that works for them is not an accommodation. It's just common sense.
I loved it. So maybe we can backtrack now.
Go anywhere we want. Where are we going now?
Because obviously, with your tagline, if I may say that, start with the end in mind. We're just backtracking now. What exactly are you doing, and how did you get to where you're now?
Do you mean from a work perspective, or you mean the book?
From everything. So what has led you to the path that you're on now?
Yeah, so I mean, obviously Matt Wallaert, I'm the Chief Behavioral Officer at Clover Health, right, which is an unusual title and an unusual team in an unusual organization. Mm-hmm. And I think people often ask me sort of like, how did I get to this Chief Behavioral Officer place? And the thing I always, it wasn't like I like sat back and was like, I'm going to be a Chief Behavioral Officer someday. And I think there's way too much of that. I have a friend who I love who he's just really linear about his job path. He's on the path to be like, I want to be the head of product at a really big company someday, right? Fortune 10, I want to be the head of product. And so like everything he does is like moving in that direction. But I think that's so incredibly rare, right? I think for most people, it's, do what's right in front of you for 2 years and then pick your head up and say, okay, am I still moving in the right direction? So if I look at my career path, every 2 to 3 years, I've changed, right? I've said, okay, like I still want to be moving in the general direction, right? So I know, it has to help underrepresented folks. It has to be, I am not interested in luxury or privilege. I'm interested in the antithesis of that. I know that it's probably psychologically influenced, right? Given my background in psych, I know it's probably, sort of product influence, given my background in product. I know it has some business component, right? So even if it's a nonprofit, it's kind of a business-oriented nonprofit like the Goodwill, or it's sort of conversely, it's a business that is in the, that believes in doing good, right? So straddling that line. Those are global values, but that describes a great number. That's a holistic giant hill over there. And, what form that takes changes dramatically year to year. And I think that is okay and important. I think people often are uncomfortable with the notion of zigzagging. The example I always give is there's this weird country sport that nobody actually does except people who live in the country, which is called orienteering. So orienteering it's a race, but it's a race from nowhere to nowhere, right? So it's not like, the New York Marathon or something where you run around on this very defined thing and there are people cheering alongside. You go out in the woods alone with a map and a compass and you're like, stand here at point A and you have to run to point B. But point B is like some fucking tree over there, right? Like there's no path. It's just over there somewhere. And I think where people make a mistake is they often sort of plan to like walk, right? They walk a very straight line because a very straight line feels efficient. But the problem is when you're walking, you're just really slow, right? And so what I think you need to do is say, hey, the things I value, working on the underrepresented, like applying psychology, these things, those things that I value are over there. But the best way to get there is to run. And then every 2 years, pick your head up and go, hey, am I still running the right direction? And if I'm not, I'm going to pivot. I'm going to move. That's okay, right? People are like, oh, I'm throwing away everything. The thing I love about my career, and I have this conversation with people all the time, is you look at my resume and you're like, wow, it seems so logical, right? It seems to make sense. You do these startups, then you go to this thing, like it seems to make sense. But like at the time, it felt crazy, right? Like at the time, people always, it's so funny. People in retrospect are like, your career looks very logical, but in the moment, they're always like, you're crazy. So when I, exited the second startup and I went to Microsoft, people were like, Microsoft, you just built and sold some startups. Like, why would you go build more startups, right? That's what you do. If you successfully exit startups, you go found more things. And so people thought that was crazy to just like unprompted go to a big tech company. And, I think there's lots of things that seem crazy at the time, and then you look back on them and you're like, oh, that makes sense. And so the reason for that, I think, that hindsight bias is, well, if I'm always moving in the direction of the things I care about, if I know there are these global holistic values that I have, then when I turn around and look backwards, yeah, it's not a straight line, but I certainly see how the points connect, right? They're not random. I can make a constellation out of that.
Exactly. It's just a perspective from which angle you're looking at it, and no line is straight. We have to zigzag. And I think you mentioned a really good point with the pivoting. It used to be seen as something bad. Well, something didn't work, so we need to pivot. Whereas these days, it's actually the biggest blessing that we've got, because it means we don't have to do the same thing for the rest of our lives. Because jobs are changing, jobs are getting replaced for a good reason. There's so many tasks that we don't want to do anyway. So if technology can replace that, so be it. But it also requires us to think differently and change our way of, okay, so what have I done now? What is going to be relevant in a few years' time, and how can I get onto this path? And maybe if you could talk a little bit more about the science behind those changes. What's happened in the brain when we need to change and when we need to take control over this pivoting ourselves, rather than being thrown into the deep end by being made redundant or whatever comes in our lives?
Yeah, so it's interesting. I mean, we talk on my team often about T-shaped people, right? So having a deep area of expertise, a functional area of expertise, not an area of knowledge, not I know a lot about X, but rather like I can do a lot of X, right? And then broad arms, right? So you want really deep legs and broad arms, right? And so everybody on my team, like if you're a project manager on my team, my expectation is that you will learn from the qualitative and quantitative scientists that work alongside you. That's not going to be your legs, but you need to like learn how to do those horizontal things. Mm-hmm. And I think so much of what makes people really valuable these days and makes them resilient in those pivots is having broad arms. I think people over-indexed on having deep legs. And then, when they got knocked over, there's no arms to sort of rely on, right? There's nothing to sort of prop yourself back up. But if you're constantly broadening your arms, then you can be really resilient to changes in the market. Now, the danger of that is that you don't deepen your legs enough, right? That you don't go deep enough in a topic to be valuable for that topic. I do think people need to have mastery and expertise. I think it is important to find something that you can be really, really good at and make sure you're really good at that. And so I think there's this constant trade-off, between those two. So when you talk about like changes in the brain and things, the thing I often actually most think holds us back is identity. So often people identify as the legs. I'm a nurse, right? My deep legs are in nursing, like I'm a nurse. And so they can't think about, then when they lose their job in nursing, they can't think about other career paths because their whole identity is tied up in those legs. But if you give yourself permission to be more than one thing, right? I'm expert at blank, but I can also do these other things. Then when that time comes and you need to be resilient, like you can apply that identity in more than one domain. You can say, I'm going to bring that expertise, right? Like nursing is a role. There's a whole bunch of skills under there that go broadly. It's so interesting. My mom was a floor nurse for many, many years. She was RN in a hospital. And then when she ended her career, she ended it in actually nursing informatics, nursing education, right? So she was teaching nurses about how to use tech tools in nursing. And in many ways, I think that could have been a very hard transition to make from an identity perspective. But I think what made Mom successful in making it was, to her, they were both about caring for patients, right? Whether that's direct care for patients on the floor or that's teaching other nurses and using systems to improve care for patients, her legs was patient care, right? And so if you define your identity as something more core, more value-driven, more important to you, very central to yourself, then I think there's lots of ways to pivot your career that solve that need, right? I sort of often on stage to help people sort of get this, I hold up a pencil, right? And too often what we do is we think about the back of the pencil, right? But what we're trying to do is control the front of the pencil. So if you want to control the front of the pencil, like plant that and then pivot the back of the pencil. And I think people just have the wrong pivot point. They sort of forget that it's not about what you do now, it's about what you value and can do and how that can be applied horizontally in the world. Because everything can be, very, very rarely, it happens, but very, very rarely does all of our need for a skill go away, if that makes sense, right? Like, it's very rare that like a skill dies out. Now, you may need to use that skill in a totally different place than you ever sort of thought that you would need it, right? If you spent your entire life, repairing tractors and then tractors go away, it's really easy to be like, well, now I don't have a job anymore because the only thing I know how to do is repair tractors. But if you know how to repair tractors, there's a million mechanical systems that operate in the same way as a tractor. You can go drones. Drones and tractors are not that far apart, right? And it's very rare that a set of basic skills like mechanical skills goes away. And so I think that people just, when you think broadly about your career, when you broaden those arms and recognize how else it can be applied, I think that one of the dangers of the non-flexibility in work is that people don't get to have those conversations. They don't realize all the ways their job skills are applicable in other ways because they're not having conversations with people outside of their lane because we tell them they have to be at their desk from 9 to 5. Creating opportunities for them to meet people and talk to people who are in other functional areas who they can learn from, who can learn from them, that broaden those arms and say, hey, I'm going to learn something from someone else. We do a thing on my team where, we have a 2-hour meeting every Friday where they're reviewing their projects with me. It's my chance to get really ground and oriented and give their feedback. And then we spend an hour doing arms and then half an hour doing legs. So during arms time, someone from the group teaches everyone else in the group a topic, right? Hey, I'm going to teach you about really basic SQL, right? One of the quants will teach us about really basic SQL, or like inferential statistics, or one of the quals will teach us how to interview members, right? How do you actually work directly with people? Or the PMs will teach you about like, this is how you use project management software to automate shit, right? And then they have legs time where they go off as a functional area. Hey, the quants go off together, the quals go off together, and they go deep on some topic that I have no interest in, right? Like, the things the quants are talking about are way beyond my understanding because my legs aren't in quant, right? But they need that time to drill down, but they also need that time to broaden. So I think it's a lot of fun.
It's so good because I always say when you're in a jar, you can't see the label. And this happens with our career when we're just in our little bubble in the same company, same industry. That's all we know. This is all we are feeling safe with and comfortable with. It's hard to see, well, there's actually a gazillion other ways if you just choose to see them. And if you get an external coach to give you more perspective, it makes you so much more opportunistic. So I totally agree. So maybe if you could just give us a little bit of insight as to what do you think the future of work is?
2 minutes. Re-ask the question, but I got 2 more minutes and I got to do something.
No worries. What is the future of work in your opinion, and how can we prepare for it?
So interesting. So what is the future of work and how can we prepare for it? So, I think the future of work is very much like the past of work. So people highlight the way that work is changing, but it has always been true that work is about meaning and outcome, right? And I don't think that's fundamentally going to change. We may measure it differently. Those meanings and outcomes may change. Our roles in those meanings and outcomes may change. But at the end of the day, the future of work is going to be a lot closer to the past of work than it is going to be different, right? And so I think one of the things that people, when they're thinking about the future of work, don't do is they need to look at like what has made work the same throughout history. What has remained common in work throughout history? Because there have been changes, right? We've changed wage systems, right? We've changed working condition systems. We've changed the output of work. We've changed all of these different things. But people still show up for, meaning-oriented reasons, right? That has been true since the beginning of time. That's not new. I love it when people like ascribe that to millennials as if millennials are the first people to care about the outcome of their work. People have cared about the outcome of their work since the beginning of time, right? I always think about the scientists involved in the Manhattan Project who, you look at their writings and they're wrestling with the what is my work going to mean? Is it going to, it's going to mean the extinction of, the death of a bunch of people? How do I feel about this? Right? They're wrestling with things from the beginning. That's not new. That's not millennials. That's everybody. It's always been that way. And so I think we'll have an easier time envisioning the future of work if we spend more time thinking about like what has always been true. And so when you talk about preparing for the future of work, I think it really is doubling down on, we have no idea what's over the next horizon, right? We're all explorers, we're all in Star Trek, it's all the Enterprise, like there's another undiscovered quadrant out there somewhere, right? Preparation is not about knowing what's over the hill. It's about using your inferences about the past to say, well, these have always kind of been handy and they're probably going to keep being handy, right? Time, being on time, knowing how to communicate, those have always been handy. We're probably still going to be handy. And so if you get good at those basics, you make yourself really resilient to other things. So I guess I would say preparing for the future work is about, lengthening your legs and broadening your arms, right? You just keep doing that over and over and over again until you're ready to not work anymore.
Amazing. Well, to wrap up, where can everyone find your new book and connect with you further for a chat?
Yeah, sure. So the book's on Amazon. You can buy it. It's translated in a bunch of different countries and things. And then you can find me on social media at Matt Wallaert, or just send me an email at matt@mattwallaert.com. I'm an easy guy to find, and always happy to help. I don't charge for speaking, and I don't consult, but I'll always give you free advice. Like, I believe very passionately that behavioral science can make everything better than it is. It's not the solution to everything, but it can make everything better than it is. And so, for me, it really is just about spreading sort of how do people actually go about doing that? How do they see themselves as behavior, as permissioned to do behavioral science in their life.
Oh, amazing. Thank you so much. I really loved every single second of it. And obviously I will share the transcript and all of it with you. And we'll probably go live in about 3 weeks. But
whenever you get around to it, just let me know and I'll blast it out on social, and I will come see you in Australia soon, or come visit New York.
Yes.
Come to New York. All right, Petra.
All right. Thanks so much. See you, Matt. Bye.